There are many different strengths and weaknesses of high-stake testing in school. All students are taking the same test, and all students are treated in the same fairness, and there's no bias when it comes to high-stake tests because they're made, specifically to each grade, and all kids are taking the same one. However, not all students are on the same level, and they're not all the same in general. So some end up struggling from the beginning for various reasons. There are recent findings that not all high-stake testing are good measures of intended targets. So that would be a con or a weakness of that. And then teachers can help prepare students to take high-stake tests by, as the chapter says, the contents and the layouts of testing, because they're so predictable. You can emphasize the need for vocabulary, comprehension skills, and similar question types that are included in standardized testing. So as a teacher, if you go over vocabulary and comprehension skills daily, I believe that's a big help for reading tests because they will be exposed and become more familiar with those different types of questions or the skills or whatever it might be. And then an account of how present day testing practices influence my teaching and my students' learning. For me, I've found myself in places where I've taught more towards the test, making sure I teach the exact things that come from the standard or that I know students need to know specifically, that maybe have been on past tests. And this at times has hindered me from teaching more things that go further than the standard, things that you can teach further out, reasoning skills or just different things that don't go straight to the standard. And then high stakes tests fail to measure all that is important in your students' development as readers. You may have students who struggle with test anxiety, but may be the highest reader in your class. And so, they may show up as a low reader, even though they're actually very good at reading and comprehension skills, but because they're stressed out by tests, they won't do well. And then high stake tests also cover a very small percentage of reading skills that are important in reading. So if standardized testing is the only way we classify students as successful readers, then we may miss out on a lot of content that also makes them successful, which is content that may be left out of the standardized testing. And then an account of how well the high stake tests used in my district, and describe the student achievement in relation to the mechanics of reading and higher order thinking. So in the school I taught in previously, the high stakes tests were great because they showed educators, parents, and students where each student was according to their specific grade level. However, I felt as though I needed to teach to the test rather than elaborating on standards and other comprehension skills that go even further than the standards. So my higher level students did much more higher order thinking than my lower students did, just because I couldn't teach those higher order thinking to my lower students because they were still learning the basics. So if they didn't know how to read at a first grade level, they weren't going to be able to answer those higher order thinking questions because they didn't have the reading skills they needed to process those questions. So it was hard because I started teaching right after schools went back to like a somewhat normal teaching environment after COVID. So a lot of my students were behind that year. So about half of them were reading at a beginning of a kindergarten level coming into first grade. So they were a whole year behind in their reading level, which made it very hard to teach past just learning how to read. The comprehension skills, I wasn't able to hit that with all of my students. So that means when it came time for the standardized testing, not all of them were exposed. And so it just made it really hard because I wasn't really teaching anything that had, it was related to the standardized test or the curriculum. I was more so teaching them how to read and phonics and things like that. And then in chapter 6, reflecting on current assessment routines and how do I make conscious and unconscious accommodations for students and how that, goes about in the classroom. I would do weekly assessments, and then we'd do beginning of the year, mid-year, and then end of the year, state testing. And so students with IEPs or 504 plans were given accommodations based on their specific needs and according to their specific plans. So last year I made accommodations for one student just to sit next to me during testing because she knew the content, what I would face-to-face discuss it with her, but every time she took the test she would get super stressed and super nervous and she wouldn't do well. And then after the test I would come back to her and ask her the questions and she would know the answer. So I discussed with her mom and we talked about the anxiety and the stress, and so I offered the option for her to sit near me during the test, and once she started doing that she did much better on those tests. And I also had a student who couldn't read on grade level because of COVID and being homeschooled and just whatever the reasons were. So I would read her the test questions and the answers so she could actually take the test. And she was very good at comprehension, so she just needed that help with understanding the reading. And so I believe, the test still showed valid and reliable information because these two students could comprehend different readings. They just struggled in different ways that they needed just some more accommodations made for them. And the only outcome I could think of that would be one that I couldn't really plan for is that my student who couldn't read may not be given those accommodations in third grade because they weren't on an IEP or a 504 plan. And so she may begin to show that she doesn't have an understanding of comprehension skills just because she's not on grade level for the reading. So hopefully that, isn't an outcome that came about, but we'll see. That could have been an unintended one for accommodations.